everybody. So, welcome. This is my birthday month, and I am celebrating by not just talking myself about the Golden Age of comic books, but talking to some of my friends about the Golden Age of comic books. So, I have reached out to them and given each of them the chance of talking about a a specific title, a specific character, a specific issue, or the Golden Age in general. Now, my first guest today is my friend Matt Hansel, and he should be no stranger to anyone who reads American Mythology Comics. And I understand that you want to talk about Dick Tracy and Batman today. Is that right?
Yeah, two of my favorites.
Good choices. So let's start with Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy was the work of Chester Gould, and it was actually his fourth comic strip. I don't know if you are aware that there were three before that. They're very obscure, and I don't think they've ever been reprinted. Do you know what those are?
I know one of them. I can't remember the title. Radio Cats, I think it was called.
That's right.
But it's about cats that have a radio show or something along those lines.
Yeah, I don't even know that much about them, but I do know that they were phylum fables. I don't know anything
Oh,
about
right,
that one
yeah,
either.
right, yeah, right.
Radio Cats and the Girlfriends.
Yes,
And they are so not what you would expect from Chester Gould, from what we know about Dick Tracy, right? So,
right.
Radio Cats was a
hmm
Dick Tracy had been a funny animal strip.
Right, exactly. That's one of the most amazing things about Chet was that I don't know that people realize they think he was this Maudevillian uh, blood and guts, black and white kind of character. And in real life, he was a warm, generous man who had a just vicious sense of humor. Dick Loker tells this story. Excuse me. Chet had played a prank on Dick, and Chet had played a joke on Dick. And to get back at Chet, Dick lowered Chester's drawing table a quarter inch every day for a month until Chet was leaning all the way over one day when he came into work and said, "All right, which one of you did this?" And that was because the joke that uh, Chet had played on Dick. I'll tell the story real quick. They needed a reference for a Tommy gun, so Chet tells Dick, "Go into the closet. There's a Tommy gun. Take it home with you and draw it into the panels. And you'll have
Uh-huh.
real life reference for it." So Dick wraps it up in brown wrapping paper, and is there. Keep in mind they're in downtown Chicago at the Tribune Tower. He gets out of the Tribune Tower. He said he's just getting ready to cross the street to make his train, and all of a sudden he can hear someone behind him say, "Mr. Loker, Mr. Loker," and he turns around and it's two cops, and they said, "What's in the brown paper bag?" And Dick's like, "Pizza," and the guy's like, "Let's take a look at it." And so they look, and Dick's like, "Now there's a story here," and he's like, "We know Chester Gould called us and told us to escort you to Union Station so that Dick can catch his train back to Naperville."
That's funny.
So his
That's
revenge,
funny.
Dick lowered his drawing board every day for a
All right.
month. But
So,
I added that story because I think people don't realize what a sense of humor uh, Chet had. And particularly if you're familiar with vaudeville and the kind of early days of stage humor and stuff like that, he Dick Tracy is rife with those kinds of tropes, especially the early days.
right now, to make sure that our readers are keeping up, Chet is Chester Gould,
Yeah,
and
oh
Dick
yes, yes.
Locker is one of the artists who later takes over Dick Tracy. Do you
And he
want to
was
talk
also. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
uh, Chester or Chet Gould and Dick Locker and what the relationship between those two are? Dick Locker takes over the strip later. Did you want to talk any more right now about
Yeah,
their relationship?
yeah. Dick was actually Chester's assistant from 1957 to like 1962 or something like that. Um, and so Dick had previous experience on the strip before he takes it over in 1983 or 1984. I can't ever remember when Rick Fletcher dies. I think it's 83. Um, and so there's a continuity on the strip of the artists in that uh, the person that replaced Dick Loker on the strip uh, in the 60s was Rick Fletcher, who took over the strip when Chester retired, and then Dick takes over the strip from him when he dies. So it's an interesting progression of artists that it's in the same hands for many years.
That's true. All right, so next up, I want to talk about. Um, so I was alive when Gould was still doing Dick Tracy in 1977, but even though my family subscribed to the Chicago Tribune, I wasn't reading the Tribune at that time,
Sure.
other than maybe the Peanuts. So my first introduction to Chester Gould's Dick Tracy was from our local library. They happened to own, I think, a couple of Dick Tracy books. You may have them in your
Was
room now.
was one of them this one, The Celebrated Cases of Dick Tracy by Chester Gould?
Yes, yes. I was going to share the cover image on my screen, but I don't need to now. Thank you. So I got to read all that stuff back in the day. So I didn't start reading the comic strip as it was going in the newspapers until much later when Max Collins was writing it, and that wonderful volume that my library had. So, what was your introduction to Gould's work?
My introduction to Dick Tracy was in the Sunday newspapers. At that point, by that point, when I started paying attention, Max Collins and Dick Loker had already joined forces and were doing it. So that's my first real introduction. As I became a fan of Dick Tracy, I got introduced to Gould's work, obviously. And that's one of the reasons why I had this book out, was because this book was my first introduction to Chet's work as well.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful volume. They don't unfortunately reprint the entire storyline for some of the cases that they do, as I later discovered in the IDW reprint series. But it was a wonderful introduction to Chester's work. It has a fantastic interview with him in the beginning. It also has a wonderful introduction and analysis of Dick Tracy and where he lives in the pantheon of fictional detectives, and where
Mm.
Chester Gould lives as an author of such types of work. And so it's a wonderful introduction to all things Dick Tracy, I think. I'm so pleased that it was one of your early introductions to Chet's work as well.
Absolutely. And it was something that Chester Gould had really wanted to do. He had submitted 60 ideas for comic strips to the Tribune Syndicate before he
Yep.
finally got published with Dick Tracy, which was
Yep.
61st idea that he sent to
Yes.
them.
And it was
And
like 8 years or something like that is
it
how
was
long it
10,
took
10
him
year
to.
span, yeah. And so he was really dedicated to the concept of being published by them. And although we think of the Tribune Syndicate as being Chicago Tribune because that's all it is today, it was a much bigger outfit in 1931. So the first paper that Dick Tracy appeared in was actually a paper in Detroit and not
Right,
Chicago. But it
right.
had
The
a
Detroit
big
Free Press.
Midwest range, and even as far as New York. Okay, I gotcha. I knew that if anyone knew, it would be you because you have connections here, right? Because I don't
Yes,
know if you ever met Chester Gould, but I know that you knew Dick Locker.
yes.
So do
I
you want to talk
also,
about that?
well, yeah, sure. I'm also on the board of directors of the Chester Gould Dick Tracy Museum Board.
Ooh, I did not
Um,
know that.
Yes, and I've been on it for almost 20 years now.
Ooh,
And that's with the family of Chester Gould. So I got to know his daughter Jean very well later in her life. And I was, for the last dozen and a half years or so of Dick Loker's life, he and I were pretty close. We chatted once a month or so on the phone. I
oh,
went down to Naperville to go visit him quite a bit, uh, just to go hang out in his studio and see what he was doing and what he was up to. And especially once he retired off the strip, he was always looking for someone to go to lunch with or some things like that. Um, so that's one of the reasons Dick Tracy is more than just a thing for me as a fan. It's like a personal connection kind of thing because I've had personal relationships with so many of the people that have been near or involved in the strip.
oh, that is so awesome. What a wonderful experience for you.
Yeah.
And so it was 1931 when Dick Tracy debuted. And in the 1920s, most Pulp Fiction detectives were private detectives, like Philip Marlowe, Nick Carter,
Right,
Mike Hammer, Nero Wolfe, and it was very rare for any of them to be actually police detectives and the
right.
hero. So this was practically unheard of at the time. But in real life, Elliot Ness was at the height of his popularity. Um, Al Capone had just been sentenced for tax evasion in the same month that Dick Tracy first appeared.
Hmm.
So could it possibly have been better timing, right, for Dick Tracy
Right,
to begin?
right.
And do you think that there's any other parallels that I'm missing between Elliot Ness and Dick Tracy, or is that just
Um, I, I don't. I don't know that there's that Chet. If you go back, what we know a little bit about Elliot Ness now, or what most people know about Elliot Ness, is myth making in some ways.
true?
Um, um, if you look through the Chicago Tribune files of that era, he hardly appears in the headlines. It's not as big a show as the legend kind of later becomes.
Not until it
Um,
becomes a show.
right, literally, right. So I've never thought that Elliot Ness had a huge impact on Dick Tracy. I think Chet was just plugged into the zeitgeist of the gangsters versus cops, of which there were plenty of headlines all the time. And into police corruption. You know, they had a list of all the police officers that were on the take in that era, and all the newspaper editors that were on the take, and it's
Oh,
like three-quarters of the Chicago police force and
oh,
half the editors and newspaper editors in the city were all on the take.
it's good side
So
income.
right. So Dick Tracy is this hero who's kind of above that fray, and he's a pinnacle of morality and all that. I think was really comes from Chet's heart, and really from his wanting to do a classic, almost fairy tale like hero. That had strong morals and believed in the right thing at the right time and all that kind of fun stuff.
Absolutely. So that makes a lot of sense because Dick Tracy is not just a law enforcer, he's also, super anti-corruption
Right.
and uncorruptible. And there's also a lot of morality to early Dick Tracy stories too. Like I had done an episode a while ago talking about the Lips Manless story, which is a morality play about
Right.
how Dick Tracy believes in him and it turns his life around and he decides to quit crime,
Yeah.
which is, not something that happens to a lot of Dick Tracy villains.
Right, exactly, exactly.
All right, so my next topic is, since this is also about comic books and not just comic strips, I wanted to talk about how he was reprinted really fast. So I've got some images to share here, and we're going to see how easily I make this work, and if I'm going to regret this decision. I'm going to share the covers of some of the earliest comic books. And uh, the first recurring appearances of Dick Tracy in comic books were from Dell Comics. Dell Comics started publishing with Popular Comics, and this is the first cover of that. And you can see Dick Tracy is very prominent on that cover.
I did not
And
know that actually. That's really cool.
mhm. And then they moved him to Super Comics like the following year. So that was what, 78, I think, and then this next one is 1938. Yeah, there we go. So that is Super Comics, and you can see Dick Tracy's featured prominently there. So
Yeah.
Dell had a lot of really big name properties. Orphan Annie, Terry and the Pirates, Dick Tracy. I mean, and the
All the
Gumps
big
was
ones,
huge at
yeah.
that time too. So Dell really had the pockets to get the big names in comic strips. And this was even before they took off in popularity with reprinting Disney stuff. So or around that same time, I should say. But even before that, this company called David McKay had already published one-off appearances of Dick Tracy. in their book feature book. And each issue, instead of being an anthology book, it was all reprint of the same characters. So this was the first appearance of Dick Tracy in a comic book from
Oh,
David
wow.
McKay. And then this lasted until 47. Dell Comics had the license to Dick Tracy until 1947, at which point it became up for grabs. And then Harvey Comics, which we know
Right.
better for Casper the Friendly Ghost and stuff like that, they took over. And then
Joe Simon drew a majority of those covers for the for that run.
well, I thought I had an image of that to share, but apparently I don't. Whoops.
The comic series I was introduced to Dick Tracy as a comic book was this one.
Let me see.
Reprinted by Blackthorn Press.
You're talking about this one here.
Yes, exactly.
How about that? That's amazing. Yeah, I also got my copy of that out in advance too, and we did not plan that in advance. This was total serendipity that I had discovered this, not at the time it came out. You probably did. But I discovered this later in a comic book show. Like this came out in '86, and I picked it up like around 1990.
Okay.
And that was my first time getting an actual Dick Tracy comic book.
Yeah.
I think I own 4 now, so I didn't collect a lot, but I bet you did.
I've got a huge stack of them, and I don't have the whole run, but my friend Jeff, who gifts me a lot of Dick Tracy stuff, he has 2 complete runs, and he's going to gift me all of the ones that I don't have. So he's very generous for that.
And these would have the complete runs of them, and not just samples of the stories.
Correct, and they're not edited or anything like that.
Well, that is good, because even
redid those.
Even in the comic books back in the 30s, when they were reprinted, you didn't get the full stories because they would have like the daily strips all accumulated together, but then they didn't do the Sunday pages then. So you would lose all the continuity that happens on Sunday, and then you'd pick up reading and wonder how did you get from there to there?
Right.
So there's definitely benefits to following in the daily strips or in a comic book version like this. And there have been attempts to bring back Dick Tracy in comic books. Right now, it's happening from a company called Mad Cave. Are you following that at all?
I am not.
Okay.
It's not. I have the first issue, and I had read long ago an advanced copy of the first issue.
Okay. In that case, let's keep going. Then my next thing is that until 1937, the bad guys were just ugly men, but not weirdly ugly. They were just normal bad guys. And then Gould invents the blank, and suddenly there's this new category of bad guy, not ordinary villains, but super villains, if you will.
Right.
Was this the key? Yeah, was this the key to Dick Tracy's success, though? The villains instead of Dick Tracy as the hero?
I think so. I think I think Dick Tracy benefited greatly from having such interesting looking villains. I think Chet knew you had to have bad guys that could really give your main character a run for his money. And Chet was the master of the cliffhanger, of the suspenseful trap, that Dick Tracy would get into, and you wonder, oh my goodness gracious, how is he going to get out of this? And the key to that was that even Chet didn't know how Tracy would get out of the traps. He said he wrote a week at a time, and he said he did that so that no one else would know what was going to happen, and that if he didn't know what was going to happen, then for sure the audience couldn't figure it out. And so that would keep them reading all the time, because even Chet didn't know how stories were going to end necessarily.
That's right. In
fact, there's a famous... and the villains help define that. You get a grotesque character like the Brow or the Mole, and Flat Top and all the rest. And I think those help define Dick Tracy as a hero, and I think that's uh, that's one of the things that another fictional character, Batman, has in common with Dick Tracy is that the villains really help define who the hero is in a lot of ways.
That's very true. Do you happen to have a favorite villain?
For Dick Tracy,
Yeah.
um, I don't know that I do have a favorite villain. I know that's a cop out answer, but I don't know that I have a favorite one. I know a lot of people would say Flat Top or the Mole or the Pouch or whatever.
Pouch.
But
Does
uh,
Pouch really have fans?
right, well, maybe I don't know. Um, but I view Dick Tracy through a different lens these days. It's more than just cops and robbers. Chet was talking about banking corruption and government corruption and the military-industrial complex and all of that. And there's a lot of commentary about those kind of things. And so the different characters represent different ideals to me, or some of the villains represent different horrific values. And so it's hard for me to pick a favorite one because a lot of them are repeats of a theme. If you really look at what Flat Top is about and Flat Top's character, he repeats that theme a half a dozen times over the next 30 years, in terms of the type of villainy and who he's talking about and his commentary on the banking system and on government corruption and corporate corruption and things like that.
And that's a good answer for someone that doesn't have a favorite. I actually do have a favorite. Mine is Mumbles. I don't know if you
Yes.
have I don't know if you have the book handy.
I
You've
don't
got
have the Mumbles volume handy.
okay. I don't either because those things are crazy expensive on eBay. Do you know what they go for these days? Like
I do not.
150 plus dollars for a
Are you
volume?
kidding?
They you
$150.
you
Wow.
could you could send a kid to college selling your collection of those. They're
Wow.
way up there. So I'll never own one. But what I love about Mumbles is that he's not grotesque. He's got a comedic shtick to him where
Right.
he mumbles lazily and no one can understand him except there's always this one guy in his gang who
You
understands
can
him and
understand.
he's
Right.
his
Yeah.
translator to everybody else.
Yep.
And I think that's really funny. But
Yes.
also he's kind of more dangerous than the others because he isn't grotesque. I mean, if
Right.
you were the brow or prune face trying to blend into a crowd to escape Dick Tracy, that's not going to work
Right.
because you don't blend in.
Right.
But this is mainly an ordinary looking guy. He's got like lazy eye in
Right.
addition to being a mumbler. But other than that, he's perfectly normal,
Right.
and that
And he
almost
could
makes
blend
him
in.
scarier.
Right. Yeah,
He's
right. And because he comes off as such a goofy villain, that I agree with you. The goofier the villain, the more deadly they actually are, the scarier they actually are. It's
Oh, I'm glad you backed me up on that. Thank you. I'm also glad that you mentioned Batman. Let's get away from Dick Tracy now and start talking about Batman. Although I do have like a segue question here. Have you ever thought about the similarities between Dick Tracy and Batman, where they were both inspired to fight crime by witnessing a murder, though in
right.
Dick Tracy's case, it's his fiance's father.
Right.
Dick Tracy
Uh,
has a boy sidekick, Junior, just like Robin, and they
right.
both got their sidekicks in their second year of publication.
Yep.
And then, as you mentioned, they both have extensive rogues galleries. Can you
Right.
think of any other similarities?
I think Batman as popularly conceived has the same kind of morals like Dick Tracy. And Batman goes even further, right? Batman won't kill even the most deadly of villains. Whereas, Dick Tracy has no problem shooting one of the
That's true.
murderers or something like that. Um, but they're both good morality tale type characters, I think. And I think part of that is because of the strength of the Rogues Gallery. Bob Kane was hugely influenced by Chester Gould and the grotesques, and Bill Finger knew that in order to build a solid hero character, you're going to need solid villains. And so that's one of the reasons, almost out of the gate, Batman has great villains that come back, because they knew they didn't know how much they could mine that field, so they brought the villains back, unlike Chet, who very seldom brought characters back.
True, yeah. And who would have thought that 80 years later they'd still be mining the same characters
Right,
over and over
exactly.
again?
Exactly.
It's an interesting answer to that because there's some things that you mentioned there, like the morality of the character. That definitely changes over time, though, doesn't it?
Sure, it does.
Batman
That's
has
right.
fluctuating morality, where sometimes he's really straight type, and then sometimes he's also bad as the villains, depending on what the times require him to be. And when he started out, he actually was a killer. He went
Oh yeah, right.
into some encounters guns a-blazing
Right.
until
He
editorial
would
decision
swing
was
down
made.
and snap, he'd swing down from the shadows and snap guys' necks when they were looking out the window. That was
I know exactly what scene you're talking about too.
right. And
That was
super
during the
early Superman is the same way, right? My favorite Golden Age Superman instance is where Superman throws a thug in front of a hail of his own bullets. I mean, that was before the characters clean up their act and take their vow not to kill.
yeah. Superman wasn't quite as bad as Batman in that regard, but he still was okay with the bad guys killing themselves.
Yes.
Like he would arrange for that to happen, but he wouldn't think of himself as the killer. That was his
Right.
morality.
Right.
And we'll have to do a separate episode about Superman. That's a whole nother topic. But my point was that I think the lasting success of Batman is that there is a version of Batman for everybody because
Yes.
he has been redesigned and rebooted and reimagined so many different times.
Yes.
So we're gonna mainly talk about the early versions of Batman today, but if you want to bring up some later ones, that would be fine too. The and as my example of what I'm talking about, I'm going to talk just a little bit longer about how when he was first introduced, he's this amalgam of several Pulp Fiction characters. He's
Right.
a weird figure of the night like the Shadow, but
Right.
he has an animal motif like the Spider, but he's also the pinnacle of human achievement like Doc Savage. And
Correct.
some of his earliest stories were actually plagiarized from Shadow and Doc Savage
Yes.
adventures.
Yeah. Right down to the panels of the drawings from the Pulp.
Right.
Right.
In fact, the I've got
Bob Kane
where is
was
it?
a notorious swiper, that's for sure.
Right. He was not what many of us would consider a great artist, but he definitely knew good source material.
Yes.
I'm going to share. Oh shoot. I wanted to share one image here, and everybody knows it. It's from the first uh it's from the first, and that's actually swiped from a Flash Gordon panel, I understand, from 1937.
Yes. Yes.
And whoa, that's terrible. Let's not do that.
Oh no.
That didn't work. That didn't work out. Like in 1940, he gets Robin, and this is when he becomes a really interesting character for me because he becomes a father figure, and he's trying to shape this then 8-year-old boy in his image, but getting it right the way he didn't get raised, so
Right.
that Robin
Right.
has hope and lightness in his life instead of all that inner darkness that Bruce Wayne had.
Right.
And it also changes Batman back. He learns how to have fun as Batman. And as we get into the 40s, he starts laughing and smiling and he's
Right.
cracking jokes with Robin while they're fighting crime. And this is my favorite version of Batman for a long time. And I'm wondering if you have the same impression of this version of Batman, or if you want to talk about some of your other favorite versions of Batman.
My favorite version of Batman is the Dick Sprang Batman. The 1940s through early 60s Batman. I'm such a big Dick Sprang fan. I even have this very rare volume of The Art of Richard W. Sprang, which
Dang,
has all of the commissions that Dick did in it, plus a huge biography and all kinds of other stuff.
I've never even seen that book.
DC Comics only allowed 250 of these to be printed, so there's only 250 of them, and I've only seen it come up on eBay once, and I bought it, and
Oh, wow.
I paid $500 for it, and that was 20 years ago.
What an investment. Don't let anything
Um,
happen to that buck.
Yeah, I don't even know what it's worth anymore. But that's my favorite Batman. And in terms of tying this a little bit to Dick Tracy, my early exposure to the Golden Age version of Batman was through the newspaper strips that were reprinted by Kitchen Sink Press in
Mm.
the 1990s and the early 90s. And Dick Sprang is one of the artists of the Batman newspaper strip,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
and there's only two examples of his originals left, and I have copies of them. I don't have the original, but these are copies of Dick Sprang's work on the Batman newspaper strip. There you can
And
see
he
a
was
pretty big.
doing this at the same time he was doing the book, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, Dick Sprang was the fifth guy to draw Batman. He's the first guy that's hired independently by DC Comics to draw Batman outside of Bob Kane's studio. So he is an interesting figure in in the Batman artist pantheon for that. DC actually inventoried his work for a whole year before any of it got published because they were afraid he was going to get drafted, but he got an exemption
Uh-huh.
because his eyesight was so bad. So he got an exemption, and then they started publishing his work. But I met Dick once. He was a wonderful, wonderful old man. And so between that and then my just obsession with him before meeting him and then since, he's my favorite Batman artist, hands down.
Yeah. I never got a chance to meet him like you did. But that must have been nice. I also like Dick Sprang's art a lot, and it's interesting how this works. So a lot of artists uh, will get ghost artists to help them out on their
Right.
titles. This has been common all through comic strips, all through comic books, and
It's the worst kept secret in the industry.
usually though your goal is to work in the style of the person that you're aping so
Right,
that it looks consistent over time,
right,
but that doesn't happen at DC Comics. Like Superman has a lot of follow-up artists that don't look anything like Joe Shuster.
right.
Bob Kane has all these artists that take over for him, and they don't look anything like Bob Kane's artwork, but
Yeah.
they still
They draw
maintain
better.
this. Absolutely, and that might be why. But they maintain this lie all of these years that Bob Kane has just developed all these different styles,
Yes.
and it's all his work.
And Bob
It,
Kane actually once referred to Neil Adams as one of his ghosts. I would have liked to have
yeah,
seen him say that to Neil's face.
I'm sure Neil Adams, who is very, oh, he's not with us anymore, is he? I'm sorry. I
No,
should say
he's
that
not.
he was a very opinionated person, and definitely would have had some strong words for him.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, but because there's so many different artists that had distinctly different looks, you can definitely go through those early Batmans and pick out favorites. Like we can talk about Dick Sprang, had a highly stylized art style
Yeah.
that is at the same time really accessible, right? It's a
Right,
very
right,
clean style.
right. Razor
It
sharp.
very easy to follow with
Yeah,
all the action.
yeah.
And I also got to experience some of that with my first experience with with Batman comic books as well. My first Batman comic book was Batman 258, which is one of the 100-page giants that came out in the 70s.
Okay.
And my mom bought that so early for me that I couldn't even read it when I had it. But I definitely looked at all the pictures, and I don't own it anymore. I wish I did. Um, it was not in good shape when I finally got rid of it. But it has a whole bunch of backups of classic Batman stories in it, and some
Right.
of them are still some of my favorite stories today. There is a story called The Three Racketeers that's from 1942, and it involves none of his famous rogues gallery. But it is
Cool.
such a perfect Batman story that I always wish that the Batman the Animated Series would have used it because it would have looked perfect in that format.
Yeah, yeah.
And then that issue also features from 1944 the third and final appearance of the Cavalier
Oh,
20
yeah,
2-ton robbery or 20
yeah.
ton robbery when he steals a whale, and that made the Cavalier one of my favorite Batman rogues, and which makes me one of the few fans of the Cavalier out there. And also that is definitely Dick Sprang's story. So
Yes, yes.
I got to read that very early on.
We could also talk about, I don't have any examples handy, but Shelley Moldoff, who was one of Bob's main ghost artists. He did so much work during the exact period that you and I are talking about. If it wasn't drawn by Dick Sprang, it was probably drawn by Shelley. And he was a wonderful man. I don't know if you ever got to meet him at the convention
So
circuit or not. But I got to meet him a bunch of times. I have several originals. And he made no bones about, that he was Bob Kane's ghost and that was that, but it was a paycheck. He put his kids through college and all of that, uh, doing it. So it was a job for him. Um, but that's interesting, and it's also interesting. We could talk about this at another time, probably. How the
there.
Yeah,
Yeah, so you mentioned Commissioner Gordon, and he is there from the very beginning. He's right
yeah,
there in the very first episode.
yeah.
Uh, episode?
Channel
No, in
One.
the first issue. The first
Yeah,
issue.
right.
And then Robin's there a year later.
Yep,
Alfred doesn't arrive until several years later, and he's a
right.
very different character when he first appears.
Yes, exactly.
So, so we don't actually get the Alfred that you're talking about until years later.
Right,
But now that
right,
we have him, we retroactively see that we needed him all along, right?
right.
This
Exactly.
this serious mentor, substitute father figure
Right,
for Batman that he never
right.
had before.
Exactly.
And then another character that's very important to Batman is Gotham City, right?
Yes, yes, of
Because
course. Yeah,
in the early days, the city was never named, and in fact, at one point, it was actually named New York
it
City
was New York.
until
Right,
it was given the name Gotham City, and that didn't happen until I think it was 1940 or maybe in 41 before it was actually called Gotham City for the
Gotham
first
City.
time.
Right, correct.
So, so what is it about Gotham City that's important, and why can't he just be a new NYC resident?
I think Gotham City has to be one of the characters of Batman, and one of the elemental parts of it, because Gotham City has to be New York at its worst.
Wow.
So all the time, it's a place of very little light. Batman, ironically, is this dark knight, right? This knight in
Mhm.
armor that comes to rescue the city. And I think in order for Batman to function properly, it's got to be like that. And New York can be too clean and too nice and stuff like that. Denny O'Neil said that Gotham City was New York below 171st Street or something like that, and that Metropolis was everything north of that.
Wow.
Um,
I
but
don't think DC ever agreed with that.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't, especially since they were in Midtown Manhattan. Um, I think Gotham City is definitely one of those elemental things that needs to be part of.
All right. Um, yeah, I have um, pretty much run out of questions for you today, except for the obligatory question that I already asked you about Dick Tracy. Favorite Batman rogue?
My favorite Batman rogue is Ra's al Ghul, I think.
Really?
Um,
Oh, interesting.
uh, One, he was created by Denny O'Neil, who was a friend of mine, and I got to know him later in his life. Him and his wonderful wife, Mary Fran. And so Roz has kind of elevated himself to that level because Denny really liked that character. He really liked writing Roz. And so he's become my favorite Batman rogue because he's as smart as Batman. Uh, but he uses his he uses his wealth and his influence and his power for evil. He's like the he's like Moriarty to Batman Sherlock Holmes.
All right. That, definitely a villain that you had to wait a long time for because we don't get him until the
Yes,
1970s.
correct.
Also fond of the Penguin, Two-Face, the Penguin mainly because Burgess Meredith, the
Right.
Batman
Sure.
TV show. We could do a whole episode about
Yes.
the Batman TV show and how that shaped all of our impressions
Yes.
of Batman. And even though
The Bright
it's
Knight.
not it's not really Golden Age because there is a book. Actually, it's right back here. Let me grab it. I didn't think that I was going to refer to this, but I'm going to do it anyways. DC came out with this hardcover that, no, sorry, soft cover that reprints all the stories that influenced the Batman TV
TV
series.
show. Yeah,
So
yeah.
they started in 1948. That was the earliest story that influenced an episode of the TV show, the first appearance of the Riddler,
Right.
which is like the tail end of the Golden Age. And after that, then you're really getting Silver Age or Atomic Age, if you count that as an age,
Sure.
stories that became the influence of this series. But it's very, very close to Golden Age in style. And that's one of the reasons why I love Golden Age comic books so much, is because I grew up with that TV show, as
Sure.
I'm sure you did too.
Yep. I did, and it had a huge influence on my childhood superheroes were Underdog, the Adam West Batman, and the Ralph Bakshi Spider-Man animated series, the 1967 Spider-Man animated series.
Absolutely fantastic stuff. Which of course he only did the second and third seasons of, but
Oh,
still,
that's
the
correct. Correct.
that the whole series was just so much fun to watch. In
Yes.
fact, I will rewatch that show and just listen to the music because that
Yes.
psychedelic jazz soundtrack is just
Yes. It's
amazing on that show.
fantastic. Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Matt, you are so much fun to talk to, but we're going to be wrapping up here. First, I want to have you have a few moments to share what you're working on so that our viewers can follow you and buy some of your stuff.
Sure. The best place to keep track of me is probably on Instagram, in terms of social media. So that's just Instagram.com/Matthew Hansel. Pretty simple. I am finishing up work on right now on a thing called Cartoon Puppet Horror Theater, which was a comic book that I did for American Mythology, who used to publish Underdog. And they're bringing Cartoon Puppet Horror Theater back. So here's the first 2 pages of the
Oh,
return of Cartoon Puppet Horror Theater.
sneak preview, folks.
Yeah, a real
Enjoy.
sneak preview. These should appear in the as backups in all of June's titles for American
Peckerhead.
Mythology. Yes. So that is I'm working on that. I'm working on commissions and things like that. And I also I do Marty and Spud for a place called Stamp Fans. And you can subscribe to that at stampfans.com/Marty and Spud.
And that's a web comic, right?
It was. Now it's a mini comic that will become a series of graphic novels.
Oh, okay. So it is in publication now.
Yep.
Actual
Yep.
paper, the old-fashioned way.
Yeah, the old-fashioned way. Yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, I really hope I get to see you at a show again sometime. In fact, you were just
Yeah.
at a show not far from me, but I didn't have the money to go, so I missed my chance to see you. So you'll have to come back to Muncie Con again sometime so that we
Yes.
can hang out.
Sure. That sounds great.
All right. Well, thanks, and thank you for watching, everybody that stuck with us. I hope that you follow up with my next interviews. I'll be doing this weekly through my birthday month, and then follow me through the history of comic books after that. Bye for now.